Alright guys, welcome to this weekend's video review, or audio review. This is MS-LS1-8. It's all about the human nervous system, focusing mainly this week on the peripheral nervous system. This is the weekend review. Let's check it out. Alright, so what we'll be discussing in this review is the standard, the sensory receptors. We have 6 different categories we talked about, the neuron and the 4 parts that we discussed, the functions of the nervous system, and then a general nervous system overview. Okay, so for the standard, we talked about how we're trying to gather information. It's scattered, so we're trying to gather it all together. We're going to try to synthesize it, put it together in a way that makes sense to us. So this is putting together like puzzle pieces. So gather and synthesize information that sensory receptors respond to stimuli. So you got sensory receptors in that little robot hand from Star Wars. It's being poked, so it's responding to stimuli. And it's going to send messages to the brain for one of two things. It's going to be for immediate behavior. We talked about this being like our peripheral nervous system. So you've got your sensing and responding side. And then something more like your central nervous system, which is you storing it as memories. So gather and synthesize information that sensory receptors respond to stimuli. And they send messages to the brain for immediate behavior or storage as memories. Let's see how I did. Awesome. Okay. So the 6 different receptor types, we talked about mechanoreceptors, and those are receptors that detect changes in pressure, position, and acceleration. So if there's some kind of mechanical movement to them, we call them mechanoreceptors. One of the ones we talked about was kind of like that yoga ball that that some of you guys sit on. When it's being sat on, it will respond to that pressure. It will squeeze and send a message to the brain. Other examples would be your inner ear. So you have little hairs inside a receptor in there that will pick up movement of fluid and send messages to the brain. So anything that picks up some kind of signal through mechanical means is known as a mechanoreceptor. We have thermoreceptors, and those detect changes in temperature. So whether it's hot or cold, they're going to pick up changes in temperature. You have nociceptors, and those are your pain receptors. Whenever you have some kind of cell damage, they're going to pick up that damage, and your brain's going to perceive that as pain. We have chemoreceptors. When we think about chemoreceptors, they bond with chemical compounds, and they communicate messages to the brain that whatever carries those compounds is what's being consumed or smelled or whatever else. Your typical examples of chemoreceptors would be something like in your tongue, you pick up chemical compounds from your food, and if you smell, you might pick up chemical compounds in your nose. Fifth, we have osmoreceptors, and those detect changes in water volume. So they might tell you if you're getting dehydrated. And since we're like 65, 70% water anyway, it's probably a good thing we have osmoreceptors throughout our body. And number 6, we have photoreceptors, and those detect visible light. You can guess where those are probably located. They're in your eyes. Okay, so you have rods and cones. Rods we have more of. They help you see well in low light conditions, but the cones are going to enable you to see in color. And those are located more towards the back of your eye. So those are the 6 different receptor types that you might need to know about. Alright, so we talked about neuron, so this specialized cell in your body that either relays sensory information, or it's going to give you some kind of response, or allow you to make connections within your body to process those sensory stimuli and feedback. So it's a nerve cell. It's a cell in your body. It's the basic building block of nervous system. And it consists of a cell body with branches. Branches being the dendrites, which are there, your little branches. Just like a palm tree, they would be like the palm fronds. And then your axons are going to carry that signal down to the bottom. So the 4 parts we talked about are going to be your cell body, also known as the soma. And in this particular example, it's at the top here. So this is more like maybe a motor neuron. Has all the same basic animal cell structures, such as a nucleus, Golgi bodies, all that kind of stuff. It governs the regular functions of the cell. It's located up there. Okay, so if this were a palm tree, you could think of the nucleus as being coconuts up there, and then the dendrites, which are next, I think. Yep, dendrites being the palm fronds, the leaves that come out of the top. Talked about how axons are like the trunk of the palm tree. Those carry messages away from the cell body, or the soma, to the synaptic terminals, which are down here at the bottom. These are extensions of the cell membrane that pass the signal on to another cell, and these communicate typically with chemicals known as neurotransmitters, but they will pass chemicals from one synaptic terminal to another cell's dendrite through a gap called a synapse. So typically the signal goes through the cell electrically, so it gets down to the synaptic terminals, where it will activate a chemical, and the cells will talk to each other through chemicals across a synapse. Alright, so how they're transmitted, a message from one neuron to the next. You have electrical impulses that will travel down the dendrites, across the cell body, and down the axon. At the end of the axon, where those synaptic terminals are, like the roots of a palm tree, that message is converted to a chemical signal. Chemicals will flow across that synapse. There's that word again. Let me see if I can't. Yeah, cool. Synapse to the dendrite of the next cell. The message is converted back to an electrical impulse and it will travel down to the next axon. So that's how you're going to transmit a signal from your sensory receptors all the way down your sensory neuron to an interneuron, etc., etc. Okay, so we talked about the process of transmission. So you're going to have your sensory receptors will obviously receive sensory information. They will pass that down the sensory neuron, down this axon, and then you will have at these synaptic terminals, they will join to the dendrites of the next cell, and they will have chemical conversations. There we go. And then after the chemicals have been received by the next neuron, it's going to pass electrically through that part of the cell until it gets to the next cell. This middle part is your interneuron, and that's going to be typically it's going to be actually only in your central nervous system, so your spine and your brain, and they often do not have the Schwann cells, the fatty little hot dog buns that wrap the axons of your sensory and motor neurons. And again, the job of those Schwann cells are oligodendrocytes or myelin sheaths. Lots of different names for these things. Right, is to speed up transmission of a signal. Transmission. It's hard to draw on a computer. Okay. So again, the signal is going to travel down the interneuron, be passed on to a motor neuron. Again, electrical, 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 and then it's going to turn into chemical at that synapse, and then be passed on down the motor neuron to a sensory organ, so a muscle or other kind of response organ. Okay, so that is the reflex arc, I guess you could say. You've got your, again, just to recap, you've got these sensory receptors, whether it's your osmoreceptors, your thermoreceptors, whatever it is. They're going to receive some kind of stimulus, something's happening to them. They're going to relay that information down the sensory neuron. That'll be connected to an interneuron, and either the sensory information will be stored in your memory, or it will be relayed to a motor neuron to respond. Okay, it just depends on the situation. All right, so that is the mapping out a reflex arc. All right, so we talked about 3 different types of neurons. You have your sensory neurons. Those pick up messages or stimuli from the senses and take them to the interneurons. You have interneurons that transmit impulses between neurons. And you have your motor neurons. Those carry responses from the brain or the spinal cord to muscles and other response organs. Keep in mind, your sensory neurons and your motor neurons, let's see if I can circle these, yep. Your sensory neurons and your motor neurons are peripheral, and your interneurons are going to be central nervous system. Alright. And again, all your neurons will carry messages in only one direction. Okay. In terms of functions of the nervous system, we broke them down again into your peripheral and nervous system responsibilities. The first one would be to store information as memory. It also controls your thoughts, your emotions, your personality, and your reasoning. And those would be considered, we talked about this, those would be considered central nervous system functions. And then the third one would be that it regulates your internal functions like breathing, heartbeat, digestion, blood pressure, those kinds of things. They also help us observe conditions outside the body, and it controls voluntary and reflex responses to those stimuli. So if you're having stimuli and responding to stimuli, that's going to be a peripheral response. I'm just going to put NS for nervous system response. Okay, so you got your first two being central and your last two being peripheral in terms of the functions of your nervous system. And then we broke down, just kind of zooming into the peripheral nervous system. We'll get onto the central next week. But in terms of the peripheral nervous system, it's broken down into two main categories. So those main categories would be the sensory, so the stuff that you can feel, relegated to your sensory receptors, those 6 that we talked about. And again, with those sensory receptors, it's good to think of some kind of acronym or sentence or some way of remembering them. I use Mountain Cop. So the acronym Mountain Cop, MTN space COP. So you have your mechano, thermo, nociceptors, and then your chemoreceptors, osmo, and photo. So you have your sensory division, then you have your motor division, so the movement side, the reflex side. Your motor division is further broken up into 2, which would be somatic, things that you have some control over. So your voluntary responses when you move your arm or move your body, that's usually going to be a somatic response. Then you have your autonomic, which is going to be your things that happen automatically, your heartbeat, digestion, those things you don't really think about but happen anyway. That would be your autonomic system. Your autonomic's broken further down into 2 more, and then we're finished. You have your sympathetic, which is your fight or flight, your get going kind of response, and your parasympathetic response. So if you had your earphones on, that probably makes you jump. That would be me engaging your sympathetic division, and then your parasympathetic division is picking up new stimuli in your ears. I'm still talking, nothing happened. You realize it's not a big deal, it's just Mr. Wampler being stupid. So you've got your parasympathetic, that calms you down. It takes all your little dials that just got dialed up and dials them back down. It says don't worry about it. Think about it as being like in a parachute, just falling down to earth and kind of resting and hanging out. That's your parasympathetic. So sympathetic gets you going, and parasympathetic slows you down. So that's peripheral nervous system in a nutshell. Think of the peripheral nervous system as being your sensing and your movement side, and then central, we'll talk about next week, is your thinking, feeling, that kind of side. All right, well, thanks for sticking with me. If you have any questions, just feel free to email me, and I'll get back to you soon. All right, look forward to seeing you next week.